Let's examine the right and left lung and discuss the features of the lung themselves, their surfaces, and the hilus. So first, let's take a lung and have an idea of what general features that we have on the lung. So first of all, we have different surfaces of the lung. We have our diaphragmatic surface. We have our mediastinal surface. We have our costal surface. And then we have our apex, which is found at the top. So we have the diaphragmatic surface which rests on the diaphragm, mediastinal, costal, and apex. With the lung, what we have with the different surfaces is we end up having a thin anterior border and then a rounded posterior border. And the inferior border is what separates the diaphragmatic surface from the costal surface. The different features of the lung appear as such. So the left lung, which we have here, we have an oblique fissure, which separates the superior and inferior lobes. The oblique fissure, as I said, will be found at the level of the sixth rib. On the superior lobe, you have this inferior projection. This is known as the lingula, right here. On the mediastinal surface, what you're going to see is the hilus of the lung, where different vessels are going to enter or exit. As you learn in the course, you know that the pulmonary veins are most anterior and inferior. Then you have the pulmonary artery, which ends up being the most superior, and then the bronchus, or primary bronchi, that is behind the pulmonary veins and kind of in the medial posterior section of the hilus. Those vessels together make up what are called the root of the lung, and they enter at the hilus. So as we learned in the class, as I just said, the pulmonary veins are usually the most anterior, and this is another pulmonary vein here, most inferior. Because of variation, no two lungs are going to be the same. So you need to be able to look at the lungs and find out what the veins are, what the bronchi are, and what the arteries are. The bronchi are usually the easiest to tell because they have the plates of cartilage within them. This here is the bronchus. And if you were able to look a little closer, you can see the little plates of cartilage that keep the wall, the structure of the bronchus, rigid. Arteries tend to keep their lumen size. They're more structured. They have more smooth muscle, and thus they don't collapse quite like the lumens of the veins do. So what we have here, as I said, the two pulmonary veins, the pulmonary artery, and the bronchus. On the left lung, which we have here, the left lung, there are certain impressions that you need to know about of things that come in contact with the mediastinal surface. First, we have the cardiac impression, which is made here by the left ventricle of the heart. Rounding around the hilus of the lung, we have the aortic arch. Then coming down behind the hilus, we have the descending aorta. Then inferior to the hilus and anterior to where the descending aorta will be, you have a groove for the esophagus. A mnemonic to remember this on the left lung is the word CADE, C-A-D-E. The C stands for the cardiac impression, the A for the aortic arch, the D for the descending aorta, and the E for the esophagus. If we look now at a right lung, many of the features remain the same, with the exception of the fact that the right lung is split into three lobes. So you still have your oblique fissure at the level of the sixth rib, but now separating the superior and middle lobes, you have the horizontal fissure found at the level of the fourth rib. You still have a pointy or more narrow anterior border and a rounded posterior border with your diaphragmatic surface, mediastinal surface, costal surface, and your apex. Keep in mind that your apex will range from 1 to 1.5 inches above the medial third of the clavicle. For the right lung, the items that come in contact or leave impressions on the lung, There's a word to remember that, and that word is, rets. And you can remember that rets applies to the right lung because there's an R in it. So rets stands for the right atrium, which is going to be making its impression right here. The esophagus, which actually comes down, around, and back behind the hilus of the lung. The T is for the trachea, which there's a groove for right here before it gives off the bronchi. And the superior vena cava, which ends up going right through here. Okay? So again, you have your right atrium, you have your esophagus, you have your trachea, and you have your superior vena cava. Some other things to discuss about the lung is you have to remember that it's covered by what is called the visceral pleura. And the visceral pleura will reflect back onto what is called the parietal pleura at the root of the lung. And the surface markings for the visceral pleura, we talk about the three different surface markings being in the midclavicular line, mid-axillary line, and paravertebral line. So for the visceral pleura, or the lung itself, because the visceral pleura is attached directly to the lung, the visceral pleura is said to be at the level of the 6th rib, mid-clavicular line, the 8th rib, mid-axillary line, and the 10th rib, paravertebral line. And then where the parietal pleura reflects off and comes around, the parietal pleura is said to be at the level of the 8th rib, mid-clavicular, the 10th rib, mid-axillary, and the 12th rib, paravertebral. One thing to clarify, as this question seems to come up every year, is the difference between the cardiac impression and the cardiac notch. They are not actually the same thing. The cardiac impression is a term that is reserved for the impression that is made by the heart either on the left or the right lung. This would be the cardiac impression made by the left ventricle. And there's also a smaller cardiac impression made by the right atrium on the right lung. The cardiac notch, however, is only found on the left lung, and it's on the superior lobe. So if we examine the anterior border of the superior lobe of the left lung, we see this dip in right here. And then you have the lingula. Superior to the lingula, you have this area which is called the cardiac notch. Okay? Very different from what is called the cardiac impression.